Hi guys, today we're going to talk about the engineering notebook. PLTW engineering curriculum requires that all students keep a bound PLTW engineering notebook with them throughout their courses. If you're not familiar with what a bound notebook is, it's just one that has a spine with the pages covered and glued into that hard spine. What is an engineering notebook? It's used to formally document in chronological order all the work that a person performs related to a specific design project. Your notebook should be clear and complete so that someone unfamiliar with the work could take over this project without any additional information. Throughout POE, you guys are advised to keep all of your coursework together. Design work related to the design process of projects and problems should always be documented in your engineering notebooks. All other documents and work should be kept in a course folder or binder. Now, these bound notebooks are low cost. They should be quadrille ruled notebooks. They're available at most supply stores, but they generally do not have pre-numbered pages or designated locations for the dated signatures of the designer and witness. If they aren't pre-printed, it is going to be your responsibility to individually write this information in ink on each page before beginning an entry. I'm going to have you guys start doing this after this presentation concludes. Who uses an engineering notebook? There are many school and career connections for how engineering students and professionals all use the engineering notebook in industries today. For example, many college engineering programs require students to keep an engineering journal as process documentation of a project. Fully documenting the design process provides students an opportunity to gain experience and skills that are important in the engineering profession. Another example is in biomedical science. They often use lab notebooks, and in computer science, they often use development journals, which are often required by their organizations as documentation of their professional work, and it might even be considered property of that organization that they belong to. However, many organizations which professionals work for often have their own guidelines to maintain an engineering notebook, so you'll likely have to adapt to those different guidelines depending on your actual career. And finally, an engineering notebook can be a legal document that an organization uses for various purposes, such as patent applications, recreating a procedure, or documenting the result of a test. In addition to individual inventors who may eventually want to claim intellectual property rights for a new idea or product, research and development R&D firms, as well as companies that perform their own research and development, require their engineers to keep engineering notebooks. Engineering notebooks provide evidence when seeking a patent and facilitate the continuity of a project when personnel changes occur. Why keep an engineering notebook? As I mentioned before, an engineering notebook is recognized as a legal document that is used in patent activities to not only provide the origin of the idea that led to the solution, but it also proves when events or ideas took place, and it proves the diligence or their efforts from start to end on how they turned an idea into a final solution. I did want to bring to your attention a couple of misconceptions about the engineering notebook that have taken place over years, especially in my classes. The first one being that the engineering notebook documentation guidelines in the course are the only guidelines that should be used. That's just simply not true. As it is, most organizations actually require an engineering notebook, but they maintain their own unique guidelines to improve consistency. For our class in PLTW, they maintain these guidelines for consistency, mostly for among student work and to establish good documentation habits for you to use moving forward, whether that's in college or in a possible future career. A second misconception is that a patent belongs to the first person who can prove that they invented something, regardless of who and when a patent was filed. This actually has changed over the years to now where it's the first person to file a patent has the actual priority. So it's important to note that at one time, documenting the creation of a new invention in an engineering notebook was sufficient to establish a recognized date of invention to serve as the basis of the patent application. However, the U.S. patent laws have changed over the years, as I mentioned. Patent law in the U.S. has transitioned from the first to invent to the first inventor to file. In regards to the notebook contents, an engineering notebook should provide a record of all details related to a design project. The list I showed you guys is not all inclusive. Everything you do or think about with respect to the design project should be included in the engineering notebook. Pictures are an excellent way to document parts of your process, and they can also provide evidence that words alone simply cannot convey. All right, moving forward, we got engineering notebook sections. The sections of an engineering notebook should include at least the table of content, chronological entry pages, references, or a list of sources cited. We typically use APA format for those. And contacts, that would include names, positions, contact information. The items listed above are highly recommended. As a reminder, there is no one correct way to keep an engineering notebook. Remember that the goal is to document your design process so that you can prove that the work is original, when it was completed, and that it belongs to you. The more details you can include and the better organized your notebook is, the better off you're going to be. As a reminder, it is best to include a title page in a table of contents at the front of your engineering notebook. Set up separate sections within your engineering notebook for general chronological daily activities, which can include any combination of notes, sketches, images, summaries, technical drawings, etc., related to that project. I would ask that you always include a reference section to list reference sources, again using APA citation, and you should always leave several pages at the back of your notebook for contact section to list all the contacts that you use throughout your projects. Again, in terms of the standard page layout, these are just suggestions for your engineering notebook, but they are highly recommended. For POE, you will be assessed on your diligence in following these best practices. However, remember there is no one correct way to keep an engineering notebook. There's just a few guidelines that we try to follow. To kind of go into a few of those best practices that I just mentioned, these are just best practices to keep for any engineering notebook, not only for this class, but every class for engineering moving forward. Again, your goal is to provide as much detail and organization as possible so that there is not a question about your design process and when it was completed. At this level, you may not feel super comfortable completing sketches in ink. If you must complete sketches in pencil, I just suggest that you trace over the pencil sketches with pen immediately after completing your work with the pencil initially. I strongly suggest not using markers because they often bleed through the paper and then it's very difficult to read. And again, just as a reminder, the notebook should be bound. You shouldn't use a spiral or loose leaf notebook, and pages should never be removed from the notebook at any time. When you do log your entries, it's best practice to always begin at the top of the page, working left to right, and always top to bottom. Please do not leave any blank space on any page. If for some reason your project ends and there's still some extra space, just simply draw a line across it and make sure to sign it and date it. With this best practice, this one often gets overlooked, but I think it's super important that you include it in your engineering notebook. It has to deal with progress entries. You should always reflect on your tasks accomplished. Think about your successes and things that didn't work so well, and maybe possibilities for if you were to kind of take over this project again, what changes would you make or implement moving forward? And always you should reflect on your future needs and any tasks that still need to be completed. Since we are using pen in our notebook, often we do make some mistakes here and there. That's okay. Do not try to erase it or use whiteout. Instead, just simply draw a line through it and enter the correct information in above it and just make an initial that you made that change. So again, never erase or try to remove anything from your notebook. Simply cross it off, date it, and put the correct information above. As I mentioned before, you should simply date each entry. So this is just showing you an example. Anytime you implement anything in the notebook, when you're done, date it. Again, throughout the semester when you guys are designing your projects, you're probably going to have to implement a few pictures here and there or sketches. Anytime you need to print something off and implement it inside the engineering notebook, Glue is always going to be preferred, and that's simply because it's more permanent and less susceptible to any type of alterations. And then just coming back to sketches, anytime you implement a sketch in your notebook, make sure to name that sketch, kind of identify its function, um, specify what materials you're using, and include any important dimensions. I'm really looking for you guys to describe each of your sketches in pretty good detail. I want you to write down what you would say to someone who asks, "What is the sketch of?" And in your description, you should be able to answer that. What would you write next to the sketch to make sure that that someone receiving it in a fax could understand exactly what the sketch is in all of its aspects? And when you're taking notes and you're writing down calculations or formulas, just make sure to always define all the variables. Include the units. I think that's pretty important because students in our class tend to forget to use units, and whether you're talking about 12 feet or 12 inches is significantly different. So just make sure to keep those details in mind, and always provide enough information so that any other person could follow your calculations and work all the way through. And when you near the end of a project, you and your classmates, whoever's working in your group, your group mates should always confirm that the events and facts on each of the page that you guys worked on together are accurate. And then you should always have a witness sign off in the appropriate location. And you should do the same for the other person. So finally, just to summarize what I talked about in the last few slides, I know it was kind of a lot. I apologize for that. I just wanted to give you a lot of detailed information at the beginning, just to kind of show you the expectations that I have for not only my class, but other classes, and hopefully someday in one of your work professions. So up at the top left, again, you should always use a bound notebook with all original pages intact. Again, nothing should come out of the notebook. Keep everything in there. Secondly, you should always have a meaningful title. Third, you should always number the pages sequentially. Always annotate your sketches. If you do make a mistake, just simply cross it off and write above it. Always include the initials. At the end of a day, you should always draw a horizontal line and then sign it and date it. If you do include any external items like pictures, always use tape. That's always going to be preferred over glue. And if you have any remaining space, simply draw an X through it or a line or diagonal line that kind of just says this is the end of that page. On the other side, I wrote down clearly label the pictures, any pictures, figures, and calculations. If you have variables, make sure you note that. And if you have any units to display, make sure you include the correct units. On the left, make sure you sign and date it as the designer. If needed, make sure you have the witness sign as well. And then if it's continued from a previous page, just indicate what that page is, if it goes from one page to the next. And then if it continues to a further page, make sure you include that as well, along with all of your team members who contributed in that project. And finally, just the keys to all these best practices that I went through with you guys today. Just keep in mind, always be neat, make sure it's accurate, make sure anybody can read it. Some of you guys might have the best of handwriting. Take your time when writing this. I'd rather it be legible and easy to follow than trying to just quickly get it done. And always be thorough with your projects and what you detail in your engineering notebooks. Thanks.